Hey class, this week we're going to talk about bushmeat. And so you had just one paper to read by David Wilkie and colleagues about bushmeat hunting in Africa. And the reason I assigned that paper is to give you there's a lot that you could read and study about this, but just to give you a sense of the actual kind of contemporary framework for what types of bushmeat animals are being hunted, how bushmeat is consumed, and where the market is for that, so that you can see that it's not necessarily, this idea that it's a lot of hunter gatherers running around depleting natural resources because they're overhunting things. That's really not the case that we see. And so, anyways, there's been similar studies done in South America as well with forager and hunter-gatherer societies there. But so you have the Wilkie paper, David Wilkie's and colleagues, and I want to share a case study with you too. I want to talk about a case study from the Kalahari. Well, we're in kind of a broader case study unit, but I want to talk specifically about a couple of things that were done with regards to community development in the Kung or Juntwasi area. So this story comes from the northwest Botswana, and it's from the region called Kai Kai. And there's two different things that they did in terms of as part of a strategy that's called community-based natural resource management. And the first is that they established a Tabololo Trust, and I'm sorry that my pronunciation is not the best, and the Kokoro Crafts. So let's talk about these two things and what they mean. First, and we have to talk about community-based natural resource management and why that matters. So community-based means that it's grassroots. So we assume that we have the social and cultural relevance and buy-in. And remember back to the model of sustainable development. Okay, so that's kind of what we have in mind when we're looking at a framework and a model for programming like this. And then resource management, natural resource management is, of course, about the environments that we live in. For people who live close to their means of production, for marginalized groups, for a lot of indigenous populations, or more so-called traditional societies, what happens in their natural environment directly impacts their health, their economy, and everything. For us, we're pretty far removed from how the environment impacts us. Not that it's unimportant, but it's easy for us to distance ourselves from environmental stresses because, well, we have air conditioning and we have heating and we have thermal jackets and etc. So it's and our food comes from grocery stores, and prices vary some, but for the most part, our diet remains the same. It's not super dependent on what's going on in the environment. Somehow there's always bread and apples at the grocery store, right? So community-based natural resource management is a really important approach for rural development in rural areas. So this is a map. So if you look at it, this is sub-Saharan Africa. This is Namibia. Here's South Africa. Here's Botswana. And so this is in the region of the Kung Bushmen, the Kalahari here. And so we have Kai Kai, and this is right up here. Okay, and a lot of John Marshall's film was filmed down here, I believe. Right? Okay. A little bit of a timeline. So the Tlabololo Trust was formed in 1994. They had a resident natural resource manager from an international NGO, and they had multiple government agencies who had supported it and kind of initiated founding this trust. And a trust, what is that? It's a savings account in a bank, right? I mean, essentially, and it has to be designated to a certain beneficiary group and beneficiary or group of beneficiaries, and to a certain purpose, etc. But it's an investment, right? It's money in the bank. And so that's why they had the natural resource manager. And the Tsabololo Trust wasn't just about money, though. It was also about protecting the game, the bushmeat, right? So they had a quota management committee, and they officially registered the trust in 1997 with Botswana. And so what they were guarding was an investment not just of money in the bank, but also of the natural resources themselves, of the game animal, etc. So it was formed by the community of Kaikai, and it was pretty broadly representative because there were only 500 people in in the population at the time. And included in this was the Kokoro Crafts Group, which we'll talk about as well. So why did they form the Tabololo Trust? Well, they were trying to um, protect the area of land because there was continual encroachment from neighbors, especially like the pastoralist neighbors who would encroach on their territory looking for water holes and things like that. To conserve the natural resources there and biodiversity, to build community cohesion, to help them retain their culture, and of course, an economic benefits to the individuals and to the put money into the trust. So what is it? What did they do? It's called the Tobololo Trust in supported or advanced, whatever, creates this community controlled hunting area. What that means is it's tied into tourism, but so you've heard of this, no doubt, that people will spend a lot of money to go to the Kalahari, to go into Africa and to do a air quotes safari, right? And to hunt a lion, or I don't know that they let them hunt lions, but to hunt some sort of big wild animal. And so what the trust did is they had a designated hunting area, and they had a certain number of um, hunting permits that they could sell for different animals every year. And when they sold one, of course, these sell for a lot of money. Figure depending on what the animal is and etc. Easily 25,000 US dollars, which is a lot of money in a small community like this, and so it's a lot of money. But with it, you don't just get the permit. You also have to hire the local guides and local people who are going to help out and run the tour and who are going to set up the camps and things like that. So it brings a considerable amount of money into the community. And even for those who aren't going to go hunting, they might just come on like a safari tour type of thing. So they made a lot of money off of this. And they also, in the Tobololo Trust, did things like the Kokoro Crafts Group. So doing, small businesses, because with that tourism coming in to see the big game animals, some for hunting and some just to see, well, there's a market then to like sell crafts and souvenirs. So they have the community controlled hunting, and again, I don't know the exact numbers and quotas of exact animals that they sell permits for, but I do know that it varies every year. And and for people who are into that sort of thing and big game hunters like that, these are quite big things, right? I mean, they go on huge teams, so you can imagine the amount of money that would bring in to a small community. The Kokoro Crafts Group did things. They used the fan palm to do basketry, and this is an potentially endangered species, but they manage it sustainably. They know when to harvest it and how much to harvest so that it regenerates and comes back in the environment, which is wonderful basketry and stuff like that. Cool stuff. So now you remember this, right? The sustainable development model. Is it sustainable? Well, in terms of the social, the blue, so the social and cultural sphere, it's community-based natural resource management. In theory, they're inclusive of the entire community. They're putting the money aside for community projects, think schools, clinics, things that the community needs. So, and it seems so, well, and culturally acceptable. I think that you could kind of go back and forth in terms of traditional hunter gatherers. Yeah, sure, they would. I mean, we see in John Marshall's film, we see them hunting a giraffe, and they would hunt, what they could hunt and eat. They wouldn't have been able to hunt the lions, but well, I mean, they would keep lions away, right? But I don't think they likely hunted them very often. So it's kind of a difference. So I think that people could argue and say, well, it's not quite the same as traditional hunter-gatherer forager societies where they were hunting what they needed to eat and to survive. it's a little bit different, but I don't think that. But I think that other people would say, well, it's they didn't, they don't. It's not necessarily morally corrupt or wrong in their culture to hunt animals. Okay, so that's, it seems like it's in the socially acceptable sphere, I guess. In terms of the environment, well, the local community members are the ones monitoring the environmental resources. They're the ones who are looking at the fan palms and looking at the animals, keeping the counts, and working with the natural resource manager to kind of set the quotas. So seems like it's sustainable. Seems like they're not. Seems like they're really working hard to manage the environment and the natural resources and conserve the biodiversity. Economically, profits will go to some go to the individuals. I guess it depends on like what role they're playing in the entire sort of industry, but a lot of it goes into the trust, into the savings account for the community. So that sounds cool, right? I mean, it seems like on the whole, I think it seems like, well, overall, it seems like a good sustainable development project. And as you're watching the John Marshall film, you can see, because he talks late as the further we get into the films, you'll see that he talks about the pros and cons of, you know, when we talk about community-based projects, we talk as though there's like this instant, immediate, and 100% consensus, and rarely is that the case. I mean, this is people everywhere. People disagree on things, and to just imagine, um, sometimes it's in our hypothetical mind, right, where we think, oh well, but the Juntoisi, the Kung, they must all agree. No, why would we think that? That there's not going to be individual differences? Of course, there's individual differences. So something to keep in mind as you're watching the films, and so even though something looks good, it maybe is good, right? I mean, it seems like a good project, but just to always be aware of the fact that very few things in this world are perfect. I guess. So some of the problems that we see in sustainable development models are equity. How evenly is it distributed? I remember one of the times it was a different trust type of issue, that there was a lot of money that was, it was actually Megan Beasley, who's the linguist you see in the John Marshall films, as she was telling me about this. She said, well, they got to this point where I know it was Polly Wiesner, somebody else who had worked with the Kung though. And she said they got to this point where they had a big chunk of money for the community, and the community had the meeting, right? A big committee meeting, and everybody was there, and they were voting on what they wanted to spend the money on. And everybody at the meeting, where the consensus was building around putting in a billiard hall. And the anthropologists were sitting at the side thinking, well, it's not our place to interject and say what they should and shouldn't spend the community money on, right? But then at the same time, we're kind of thinking like, no, don't put in billiards, because with that comes alcohol, and with the alcohol come the problems, and domestic violence and things like that. So in terms of equity and voice, there's always concerns. There's always issues of how equally distributed and how decision making occurs. Things that are meant to be community centered and owned, as you'll see, over and over again, there's always kind of an outsider there, or multiple outsiders, or government agents, including anthropologists, right? And so that's a really difficult role and position to navigate, I think, as anthropologists. Even we have to, because I mean, I've been that person too, and we have to think really wisely and carefully about what we're doing and what our role is, and what it should be. Thinking of things that are socially and culturally appropriate. I already talked about this, like in terms of the hunting. You could see that there'd be multiple, dynamics and ways of thinking about that. And finally, thinking that they are really viable and truly sustainable. And I think this drives to the underlying argument that John Marshall makes in his films. And you'll come to this as we progress in the films. He gets to the argument he makes is that he was making. He's passed, but he said that the Kung wanted to be farmers, and that it was wrong to assume that they should want to stay as hunter-gatherers forever. And Richard Lee and others said that's not true. They they're hunter-gatherers, they're foragers, and that's their culture, and we should support them and encourage them and help them find game reserves and things like that to allow them to continue that lifestyle. And John Marshall said, no, no, they want to be farmers and they want to be modern, and so you need to support them in doing that. So this idea of what's truly sustainable and what future communities want, and then to have an we have multiple anthropologists and government agents and things like that standing there in the middle, and it's tricky. And these are problems that we need to think about and be sensitive to and aware of.